Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a good audience for this afternoon's talk. And the talk is being filmed and live streamed, so be aware of that as you're in the audience. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Oliver Phillips. So I'm Yadvinder Malhi. I'm Professor of Ecosystem Science here at Oxford. And Oliver is somebody that we were discussing a while ago. We've been collaborating together for a quarter of a century, which is something both terrifying and impressive overall. Oliver described me as his oldest collaborator, with the longest duration collaborator, I think is a better way to describe it. So I know Oliver quite well over the years. He's a world-leading authority. There's many areas of the field where he's really pushed forward our understanding of tropical forests and how they're changing to climate change, how they are carbon sinks that contribute to a substantial absorption of our CO2 emissions. I'm sure the topics that he'll cover and how they're likely to change in the future. And he's had a range of accolades of these, perhaps most notably he's a fellow of the Royal Society. And over these 25 years, there are a number of features that I would say that really mark out Oliver as characteristics that I observed. And one is his combination of attention to detail on taxonomy, and the preciseness of how you measure the diameter of a tree, but coupled with seeing the big picture and going from that fine scale to the entire Amazon basin and the world's tropical forests. So combining those two is a unique feature. And similar to that attention to the science is the attention to the local partnerships, a real attention to how your local collaborators work, how they're benefiting from this scientific process and this exchange. And a commitment to the long-term relationships in those partnerships as well. So in ecology, as in some other fields, there's much discussion now about decolonizing science, about avoiding helicopter science, where rich, well-funded northern institutions go in and collect their data and publish, and very little is left for the local partners. And I think the work that Oliver does epitomizes the very opposite of helicopter science. And over the years, he's created broad networks of collaboration on these themes that he'll talk about today. And these networks have had real impacts both in science, but also in developing capacity for science, particularly in South America and more recently, more widely, but also face many, many challenges that I'm sure he'll discuss, and then how to maintain and support these long-term networks. So thank you for joining us, Oliver, and over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Fantastic. Nice to see you. Thank you, Yadvinder, for a very kind introduction. Yes, yeah. My oldest collaborator, I think. Since 1997. And we'll get to 97 in a minute. Thank you also, Charles, for the invitation. I appreciate coming here. And thanks for coming. I'm expecting a mixture of ecologists and other folks, but all will be very broad-minded, I'm sure. And I'm hoping this appeals to you, wherever your background, academically or otherwise. Okay, so I was told to talk about this, where I start to diverge from the script, I'm afraid. Post COP26, what have we learned? What were the successes at the COP? What have we learned? And what do we need to do now? And I kind of resisted a little bit that script, I'm afraid. So I tried to take a longer view, and I'm going back to those of you who remember 1997, Kyoto, which was the Kyoto Protocol, which is when kind of the world started to stand up and pay attention. Because I think we need to look back to understand where we've been as scientists and as science to really appreciate what the lessons are, the big ones. And I'm going to focus on change within what I call remaining intact forests. So there's really nothing really about deforestation or restoration and those kinds of processes, important as they are. And yeah, what I think we need to do going forward. And a disclaimer is it's not a review, and there's going to be reflections, some grumbles, hopefully not too loud, and also some hope and aspiration about where we should be going. Okay. So moving forward then, so that's, 97 was, it was a long time ago now. The COP process has been going on and on and on. One of the themes which has emerged more recently has been the idea of nature-based solutions. It's a bit of a buzzword, and that can mean a lot of things. But in the tropics, one of the big things it means for many people are carbon sinks, and in the context of this talk, are these carbon sinks that intact ecosystems provide. Okay, so that's the focus today. And I'll just give you a few political statements. So this is the UK government position, officially at least 11 months ago. God knows what it is now. Forests are the lungs of the planet. Well, that's not quite right, but hey, let's pass on that. Absorb about 1/3 of the global CO2 released from burning fossil fuels every year. Okay, good. The president of a tropical country said we're committed to protecting these critical carbon sinks. Bolsonaro was not at Glasgow. And then our very own Prime Minister, I don't know if you remember who it was back in November 2021, 3 prime ministers ago. And this one was particularly famous for having a rather, how to put it, strained relationship with the truth. But I think on this point he was bang on, or at least his speechwriter was, that forests do support communities, livelihoods, and food supply, and they absorb the carbon we pump into the atmosphere. So he would have said that with great aplomb, I'm sure. And so these are all important political statements, they're true. But thinking about it, given everything we also hear about climate change and how it's killing trees, which it certainly is, this is perhaps surprising, right? The idea that forests, including intact systems, should be carbon sinks is not actually a priori what one might expect, is it? That's hard to say, really, but I think perhaps what should be happening scientifically, just if we think about the underlying processes, are two really different things going on, and what the outcome of those forces, which pull in different directions, is perhaps not clear, at least theoretically. Okay, so on the one hand, of course, you've got global heating, and that kills trees, as you'll see. They may grow more slowly, and that means they're going to lose biomass, right? So how could there be a carbon sink with all this going on? But on the other hand, of course, you've got the rapid rise of CO2, which is a fertilizer for plants. It's not often said directly, but it is. It fertilizes plant growth, and it helps also mitigate against heat stress as well, for example. I mean, and look where it's come. Okay, this is driving climate change, but golly, it's really affecting plants as well, we think, right? So who's going to win out these two opposite processes isn't clear. And just a little digression at this point, I couldn't resist. I know there's a few Brazilians in the audience. If you look at this map of, this is estimated heating over 100 years, based on some rather thin data from the tropics, has to be said, but still, if you look at it, Brazil is the fastest warming nation in the tropics, right? And some of that is due actually to deforestation, probably on the Southeast Amazon boundary and Atlantic forest too. But that's a pretty fast heating rate, maybe 2 degrees Celsius per century already. So, in the context of this, and then the Amazon more than 1 degree, it would be perhaps surprising for the Amazon to still be a carbon sink. So how do we know, though, that these forests are sinks? And the politicians talk about it, and scientists do. And I'm going to show you the evidence. And you might think, so this is where complaints start in the talk, you might think it's something to do with these things. So NASA has a whole stream of satellites going forward and looking backwards, as does ESA. And several of these are scoped to measure biomass from space. And if you go back to read the specifications, that's what they'll tell you. And they'll still tell you that now. And there's other agencies as well. So it's not just NASA and ESA, there's also an Indian space agency, there's a Japanese space agency, and even the UK has a kind of space agency. So we're all trying to measure biomass from space. You would have thought with billions, literally billions of dollars going into this effort, they would be able to tell us what's happening inside tropical forests. They can't. they can tell us really well about this, of course. So deforestation, which is not the topic for today, that's where that investment has really paid off scientifically and politically and in all sorts of ways. I mean, that helps to open up carbon markets to some degree too, because you can track precisely from space where you have forest, where you don't, and where it's gone, and to some extent where it's regrowing. But you really, really struggle to track what's happening inside these forests. You can sense some things in the canopy, but getting underneath the canopy in particular, and estimating biomass, for example, and small changes is really, really hard from space, okay? In spite of billions of dollars, and that's the complaint. So how do we do this? How do we find out what's happening inside forests? Well, the main method is this, and this is something that, to be honest, I can't do. I can't climb, well, I could just about get up this ladder probably, but I couldn't get 10 meters up this tree to get above the buttress in order to be able to measure the diameter as these three guys are doing here in Colombia. And then you got to go back to that point, the same point. It can't be a different point, it has to be the same point at some point in the future to see how the tree's grown, right? So biomass growth. And, oh, I forgot, I was going to bring a special instrument I have, but it's in the bag outside, so I won't bring it. The tool we use to do this is a diameter tape. It's not electronic. It's invented, I think, in the 19th century. And very, very cleverly, on one side, it'll give you the diameter, and if you flip it over, the other side, it's the diameter times pi, right? So that's the trick. And you put it round the tree, and it will read out the circumference to you. That's the technology, as well as this tree climbing, that you need in order to measure how big these forests are and how fast they're changing, ultimately. Okay. You also need courage, physical strength, and other skills, and identifying plants. And these are all skills which are hugely undervalued. So again, another complaint is we really undervalue what is needed to measure forests, even as we, as a society, are spending billions on putting sensors in space. These human sensors need our attention, okay? And then how do you do that, as well as this physical process of measuring a tree? Fundamentally, to know its biomass, you need to know what species it is as well, okay? So you can imagine a balsa tree, for example, which can get to be about that big, or a Brazil nut tree can get to be bigger. The density of wood varies by a factor of 10. Okay, so you could have the same volume of tree, the same size, and one will have just 10% of the biomass of the other. So you do need to be able to identify plants as well, right? And so in terms of what we need to be doing, it's all about integration, this integration from the bottom up, those who measure trees and those who identify them. And I've been showing this slide for 20 years, I happily say that. And Yadvinder's familiar with this slide too. So this is, if you like, I would say the main achievement of Rainfor has been able to try to integrate forestry communities with botanical communities, and that's how you get to measure biomass and biomass change. Okay, so then you basically have to measure trees, and you have to go back to the same plots. Each of these sites will have many plots again and again and again, and that's how you get change estimated. So it's global teamwork, and so it's integration and it's repetition. It is literally not rocket science, right? But it requires a lot of persistence, and it's based on a lot of hard labor. So to give you an idea of the labor involved, these are just the principal investigators on a recent paper we published, kind of summarizing some of the record, okay? And I think maybe, hopefully, I'm hoping a few people in the audience may see their name there. I'm not sure. But, so that was over 500 authors. Those are just the scientists who were funded, who are doing their PhDs or their postdocs in these plots. And there's an additional, another 2,000 people as well behind the results that we publish, and you'll see, okay? So it's a huge effort, and you can't do it alone, that's for sure. So leaping now forward to what we discovered, so just in terms of the highlight, is essentially has been at least a big carbon sink across the tropical forests, so it seems. And that's a result from, if you like, rainfall's work in Amazonia, Afritron's work in Africa, and then a smaller network we've started in Southeast Asia, but actually principally Borneo. And the numbers are big, okay, so they add up to about 1 billion tons of carbon, which about half of which has been in Africa. The Asian number is really, really small, but that's not because the sink is weak, it's just because the area of intact forest in Asia is very, very small, right? So the sink strength per hectare is actually remarkably similar, it turns out, in all of these forests. In Africa, it seems to be persisting at a higher level than elsewhere, but it's pretty similar. So that's three continents, essentially 3 networks, but others contributing to produce that kind of overview. And then in fact, it turns out that when you put this tropical work together, so around here, with a bigger picture from other parts of the world, including with satellite estimates, almost all forests, where they're not being removed or degraded, become carbon sinks. They are carbon sinks, right? But the tropical stuff you see on this map is entirely based on what people have measured. It's not based on what people have seen from space. Okay, it's a really big number. And then to give you a bit more global context then, so we're going to go back now to the first decade of the year of the 2000s. This is how fast CO2 was increasing in the atmosphere. Okay, so it's about 4 gigatons of carbon per year in the atmosphere. That was less than half the emissions that humans were putting up there, okay? So what happened to the rest was the oceans took up some, but also the terrestrial biosphere did as well. So our work then kind of helped to fill in this part here, and said about 1 gigaton of that terrestrial flux was going into intact forests. Put those carbon sinks together on the right, and they sum up to bigger, they're more than the increase in the atmosphere, right? So flip it round, if they weren't acting, this number would be going up bloody fast. In fact, we'd be in deep trouble, and I'll show you how much trouble we'll be in. It's pretty easy to work out, but Kanye, the Global Carbon Project, have produced a table with these numbers in. That's the cumulative sink of the last 30 years into Earth's oceans and land ecosystems. So this is more than just tropics, right? Without these, we would now be over 500 ppm. Now, I don't know what they're saying these days that 1.5 degrees is going to be hit at, but it's under 500 ppm. We would already be in the territory of dangerous climate change and potentially irreversible climate change if we didn't have those sinks acting. So knowing why they're acting and where and what's going to happen to them is critically important, right? So returning then to the tropics, so what do we find in a little bit more detail? So the plots are kind of, they're a bit more exciting than just telling you how much biomass you have. They can tell you how fast trees are growing. And if you put enough together, you can then build up a picture, bottom up, for what's happening in each continent. And so this is just getting the growth side, so the sum of all the growth that trees are doing has been increasing over time. So this is a 3-decade record now. It goes back before my time, but the plots were established way back in the 80s. In both Africa and the Amazon, the growth rate has been increasing. Okay, so that implies to some extent a global driver, because it's happening in pretty much all forests where we look carefully enough in the tropics. That's the growth side of the equation. Then if we look at the other side, just how fast trees are dying, we see also that's increasing, at least in the Amazon. In Africa, the signal is a little less clear. But in the Amazon, what's happened is mortality has been increasing at a faster rate than growth, but starting at a lower base. So if you can imagine what's happening, is the sink itself is the difference between the gains, the growth, and the mortality. And that's been a big difference, but the difference has been decreasing over time as both those lines go up, but the mortality is catching up with the growth. Okay, so of course then, the next question is, well, what's going to happen in the future? Will the mortality catch up with the growth and overtake it? But the sink has been declining because the mortality has been catching up. And if you put it then on a graph, sort of which really kind of show this. This is the net biomass sink into Amazon forests over 30 years, and it's been kind of pretty high, but declining. Okay, that's one insight you can get from these plots. Another thing you can do, of course, is you can start to pick out some of the climate sensitivity as well. So I've just shown for you here 2 really big droughts, at least in western and parts of central Amazonia, okay? 2005 and 2010. And we pick these up in our signal of 300 plots. So on average, that sink just weakened in those sites. And in many places, of course, they actually lost biomass, right? But you can see the impact of climate events on the long term, sorry, on the signal. But you can also start to see that there seems to be something else going on. There are trends there that are not necessarily driven by individual events, because that decline started before the 2005 drought, it seems. Okay. So if we just draw a breath and look about where we are to date in terms of the lessons that we've learned from this forest plots work, and from no other sensor, intact forests in the tropics have contributed large persistent sinks. That's what's happened. Okay, that's interesting enough, but scientifically perhaps not very interesting. Perhaps more interesting is that the processes of growth and mortality both increased. And additionally, and this is kind of a logical corollary of that, therefore the forests are more dynamic now than they used to be. Okay, so the system is actually turning over faster because the inputs and the outputs have accelerated. So the system has changed, not just in state, but also in its underlying processes. Yeah? You may ask, why is this happening? I haven't really addressed that point yet. Well, it turns out the growth gains, the increase in growth, chronologically tends to precede the increase in mortality, right? So they're both going up with the growth first. And that implies that the underlying driver must be something which is stimulating growth, okay? It doesn't mean there's not other things going on. There are other things going on, but that must be the underlying driver because the growth has happened, that increase has happened first. So you can reflect on what that driver may be. But it's not heating for sure, and it's not drying that have been the real drivers of change. But I think even more interesting, at least from my point of view, is how do we know these things and how can we continue to know such things like what's happening in the tropics and why, is again by what I call ground observation, but at a big scale. And that requires people's skills, people's effort. And to be frank, as far as I know, this sink is still invisible from space, in spite of billions invested in Earth observation. Maybe the new sensors, which are really more specifically designed for biomass, will start to pick up something there. Who knows? The really big lesson, though, I think we could, standing further back, is about how we do science. It's about with people, but it's also about continuity. And it's the value of, if you like, persistence, doing the same thing again and again, which sounds a bit boring, but actually is really, really exciting because you learn things you'd never get otherwise. Okay, and so you make a case for how you invest in science. I think actually the number one thing is to make sure that you identify what works and you continue doing it rather than changing the whole time, right? That's how you get a baseline, and that's how you measure change against a baseline. You can't do it if you're putting up one sensor after another and continually changing your observation protocol. Maybe we can do both. Let's hope we can do both. And just to really emphasize this lesson about continuity and the importance of persistence with stuff which can seem pretty dull in a small scale, think about this. You know, this is, of course, the classic graph that we're all familiar with. It's now 60 years of records. It's super impressive. And early on, there was no guarantee, of course, it was going to continue being measured CO2 at all. In fact, there was a really, really hard case that Charles Keeling nearly failed to get the money to persist doing this. And only more recently have NOAA come on board and really picked up the ball. Right? So if you imagine what would have happened, say, if after 10 years the funding had been cut, the grant ran out, and there was no foundation, there was no political will. It was a bit boring. It's just going up slowly. Why would we continue to measure the same bloody thing again and again in the same place, what are we going to learn? It's increasing slowly, so what? Okay, well, you can imagine what would happen then by now. Okay, maybe we would have the technology for measuring CO2. We could go back, and at the top, we could measure it now. We'd get there. Okay, but if you are measuring a forest from the ground up, what do you need? The technology is simple, but you do need people who are trained and motivated and skilled, and to be honest, have a job to have a chance of measuring trees. You're not going to get them measured otherwise. You need that. And you also need something else, which is there's no point going around to forests and saying, I'm going to have a plot here and I'll measure that for 10 years, and then I'll go over there and there and there, and I'm going to change my location every few years. You're going to really struggle to get those sequences of growth, mortality, biodiversity change, maybe too, if you haven't talked about. All that requires persistence in the same place, but many places, and with people, okay? So this is what we would be, where we'd be at now. If we just projected from the past to the future, we would be about 360 ppm. That's what our knowledge in the past would have told us if we hadn't measured CO2 now. And of course, you know where we are, which is way up the top. And I just want to make, the point again, that if we had lost the capacity to actually measure this stuff, which is credible for forest plots, we would be clueless about not just where we are in terms of the number, but also the trend and the dynamics of the system and how they vary year to year and place to place. And therefore, we'd be pretty clueless about how the underlying drivers of change were acting, okay? So you do have to continue to do the same thing sometimes for a long time. 60 years is a challenge, and it's impressive, right? That's generations of scientists. It's, several cycles of PhD students becoming professors. So one has to find exciting science to pin on the top of it, but underlying this is what we need to do if we're going to understand how the Earth is changing. Do the same thing again and again, okay? So, okay, that's the past. What's going to happen in the future? Will these forests still help us out and slow that rate of CO2 increase, or could they become sources and accelerate climate change? I would think that no one knows the answer to that question, right? But the only way we're going to know for sure is when we look and check and see what's happening. Okay, we can model it, we can project it, we can simulate it, but you're only going to know by observing. And okay, if we do a projection, we see that what we've observed in the Amazon for about 30 years in black here, which ends about 2011 because that's the last publication and that's the last really big, large slew of data that we've had until recently. If you project that forward with a statistical model, a very simple one, it suggests we could already be close to zero in terms of the carbon sink in intact forests, okay? But perhaps more importantly, the uncertainty is huge. The uncertainty is 1 billion tons of carbon, right? That's a massive number. That's the size of the sink as we thought was across the tropics not long ago. 7 times UK emissions. Okay, so the point is that just with the statistical models, you can't know what's going to happen in the future. You still have to look. I'm just going to revisit this a bit as well. Okay, there's quite a lot of work going on right now, published, as far as I know, suggesting the Amazon is no longer a carbon sink. And I think that's correct, right? But that's correct because if you measure deforestation and so on and the other emissions from human-induced degradation, there is evidence from flying airplanes and measuring CO2, for example, that the sink has stopped. But it's still unclear what's happening with the intact forests, okay? Because no one is really looking specifically inside the intact forests. So in order to project what's happening forward, well, I'll show you a little bit of results that have happened the last 10 years. So this is now in the period where that model was suggesting a decline. And it turns out that in the cooler forests in the Andes, so that was outside the previous analysis, really for a while, there's been a pretty strong sink. That's at least as strong per unit area as the Amazon, right? Cooler forests. Now, this is a really interesting one. This is a paper from a couple of years ago, very recent, Now you remember that there's a big El Nino in 2015-16. It's a big drought. Droughts kill trees, right? They slow growth. They're going to reduce biomass. But in these forests, the biomass has increased in that period. So it's the opposite of what's expected. But these are forests in the middle of the Amazon where it's already fairly wet climatically. And also, there's a very high water table. So what seems to happen is you apply a drought to this system, and instead of slowing the growth, you potentially accelerate it because you're reducing the period in which the soil is anaerobic, right? So actually plants could do better under drier conditions in some parts of the Amazon. Now the challenge, the PI, so Tainá Souza I co-supervised, the PI of this project, Flavia Costa, says to me, rainfall is not actually measuring the Amazon very well because you're missing these high water table forests. And I think to a large extent she's right, and we need to really make sure we observe in these kinds of systems too, which are pretty hard to get to, right? And if we look towards the future, what may happen to these forests, there are really several possible sources of what I call climate change resistance and resilience. Okay, this is being optimistic, right? So we could, for example, see with CO2 increases that where the soil is nutrient rich, that CO2-induced increase continues. Okay, where you don't have nutrient problems, the trees can perhaps continue to grow faster. Or where you have a cool climate baseline like the Andes, the growth could continue as well going up. Or where you have high water tables, drought could actually stimulate growth. Okay, so essentially what we're looking at is a system where we looked at the Amazon as this big lump of green, of 6 million square kilometers of green, but it's not. It's really, really diverse and different within it, right? And there's all sorts of reasons how essentially multiple different factors are going to modify these sync responses going forward, okay? And good reasons to expect that some of the Amazon will sustain being a sink well into the future. Okay, so this is not a grumble, but it's a comment, which I hope is not too controversial. Experiments alone are never enough to explore understanding, okay? I think that's not controversial. We need models too, but we also need really widespread observations. And that's particularly when you start to look at nature, it is really, really complex. There are many factors which will affect how forests will respond to climate change, right? And no one experiment or set of experiments is going to be able to control for all of those different factors, right? So I'm going to show you just a sort of a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses for where we may expect the Amazon to resist climate change. Okay, so we might expect at the Andean fringe, where it's cooler, that warming shouldn't present a problem, maybe not. Perhaps in the southwest, where the nutrients are greatest, CO2-induced increases in growth will continue. Perhaps where it's wettest in the northwest, those forests will resist drought. Why should they bother if they've already got more than enough rainfall? Similarly, in the northeast, this is a trickier one, where forests are much slower. We would expect that the growth gains and their impact on biomass to persist for longer because there's a long residence time. So the knock-on effects on mortality will take many more decades to filter through. So under that hypothesis, we expect the Guyana Shield, for example, continue to being some sink well into the future. And then underlying all of this, this is a map of water table depth. This is what this is. So everything in blue, the water table depth is probably, this is modeled, it's probably less than 5 meters deep. So that's, not much taller than the floor to the ceiling here. And it's clear from many forests where it's been studied that Amazon trees can access water from 5 meters, right? So the hypothesis is that for all that stuff in blue, drought really shouldn't be a problem for trees. In fact, it may even be a boon. And again, the only way we're going to know is by looking. Okay. So the field sampling is useful for all sorts of things. I'm going to just spin through these a bit faster. Okay. So having made the case that these plots are absolutely essential, you need to carry on looking and do it actually in more places, I'm going to show you that most of them are essentially endangered. We're losing them. This is through lack of funding, principally, and just colleagues not being able to get to the field. And it's particularly the case in Amazonia. So if you look across South America as a whole, the best funded sites, it's not surprising perhaps, tend to be near cities, near universities and research centers, okay? Now the Amazon is really, really big, and most of it, thank God, is still quite remote. Now, if you think about these sites along here, this is BR 319, which Bolsonaro wants to tarmac. We hope he doesn't. These are really hard sites to get to ecologically, and you've really struggled to fund that work. Okay, so this is the challenge. And the cost to secure that, then, just to give it budgetary terms, is about 2% or less of the budget of one of the satellites which is going out to measure biomass, okay, in forests. Okay. Albeit it's a global satellite, and I've got a few nice friends in ESA, and I should be careful what I say, but it won't be up there forever. So it's going to produce some really nice data for a while, and then it's going to stop. And we will have spent 50 times what it takes to sustain the Amazon network for 5 years, I think, for 5 years, yeah. So the context is kind of clear. And I think there's something really quite strange. We're putting these billions on really high-tech stuff, which is great, interesting technologically, but we're not investing in the people, communities who are actually measuring forests on the ground. And it goes beyond money, because money is a means to an end, right? It's a reflection of our values to some extent. When we invest in one thing or another, we're making decisions as a society about what we think is important. So I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge, it's really important, who does the work, the physical work, that underlies what scientists talk about and what politicians talk about, really quite glibly sometimes. As I've said, I'm going to carry on saying, there's 2,500 contributors to this work across actually 62 countries in the tropics and beyond. So there's a lot of huge amount of labor. To give you just a little bit of a context then, I'll just take you back to colleagues of mine in Venezuela. So Rafael Herrera on the right here, he set up plots in 1974. So that's way before the first COP, right? We hadn't even heard of COP. No one really had heard of climate change at that stage, unless they really read carefully the literature. So that's more than 50 years ago. And Pedro Macarino, whose father was with Rafael when the plots were set up, this photo was taken 30 years later. Okay, so 3 decades, that's already long-term science. We've managed to fund it to 2014, and since then, we haven't been able to get back, and that's partly financial and it's partly political in this case, because Venezuela's been a hard place to work, okay? And these plots are the oldest plots in the Amazon, and we really, really need to get back. If anyone's wondering how much they cost, they've got some spare change. I reckon £20,000 would get them recensused. Okay, that's not really very much. And then I want to talk then about another colleague, Elisban Amos, who sadly is no longer with us. And this is really to do with Tambopata, which is a really famous site. And we hear a lot about Tambopata. I know we talk about Tambopata. It's in Peru. I love it. I did my PhD there. Elisban helped set up the first plot there in 1979. So this is almost the second oldest plot in the Amazon, not quite, nearly. He was the person who identified the trees in that plot. Right, so that the names originally came from him. His father also taught me about the forest of Tambopata and how the people there, the communities, use all the plants in the forest for medicinal purposes and for fruits and so on. In fact, helped me to publish a paper which proved that the vast majority of the trees in this region were useful for people locally in one way or another. So from an ethnobotanical view, I learned a tremendous amount from Elisban and his father. But also, I kind of learned the importance of just what it takes to start something young. He was 18 when he did this first plot, and persist. And I certainly wouldn't be talking about the Amazon today if it wasn't for Elisban and his father. So, people like these, I've picked out 2 stories, and there could be many more, underpin pretty much all of those dots on the Amazon, right? And I know those of us who've worked in South America and other places in the tropics probably have our own stories in our own places about the people that we know were critical and actually helped us do our PhD or our postdoc and everything else, or get our first grant, or inspired us or taught us so much. Yeah. So that's what underpins the work, people's lives and their enthusiasm for the forest around them. Okay. So to try and start to bring this together, I think the key challenges then for researchers and policymakers, as I was asked to talk about, is a reframing, and it's really continuity is the most important thing of all. That is what we need to be talking about. And actually, this is the second point which is related to that, it's not innovation. That's going to happen anyway. There's plenty of people doing innovation. What we need to do is continue what we're doing, but also integrate it with the new stuff coming along. Okay, and I think, if I was talking to a science council audience, just remember technology is tools. It's tools. Technology is not a question. Technology is a way of answering a question, right? And it's not necessarily the case that the newer technology is going to help you address the question better, especially if you can't compare with what's been measured in the past. In fact, it could be really, really counterproductive. Okay. And the related point, but really important, is the science needs to be equitable. We need to be not just taking data, of course, but connecting partners themselves, investing in them, in their lives, in their work, which actually means paying them better than we're able to afford to in our research grants, to be honest. And it means, of course, supporting leadership within tropical nations, because that's the only way it's going to continue. So, we just have to shift our priorities. If I've got 5 minutes or so left, I think I do, yeah, okay. I want to take you just through a couple of examples of this is the hopeful part of the talk now. How can we do things better? And so here's an example of integration. So there's a really big program plan out there right now to deal with this problem, which is essentially that there's billions of satellites up there or about to go up there trying to measure biomass from space. And frankly, none of them have got proper calibration validation in place. They have a program in many cases, but they're using existing data and cobbling together what other folks have done largely, maybe putting in a few million, but not enough. We're going to need to have confidence in these biomass maps. Those maps will underpin how countries look at their forests and how communities and companies value their forests, because only these maps will tell them how much carbon they've got. And if you don't have confidence in them, we're never going to know who has what carbon and how it's changing, right? The great thing about satellites is they give you a synoptic view. They show you everything from one perspective. So you do have to connect them to what's happening on the ground. We shouldn't be having to make this case. I mean, this thing is just kind of obvious. There should be a global biomass reference system. I mean, if all these satellites are going up, none of them are particularly long-lived. It's kind of obvious. But we have to make the case. And we think the way to do it is a combination of airborne LiDAR, which gives you a kind of landscape view, tree by tree, really, really precise, but from the top down. You connect that with georeference plots. You can build up a whole landscape where you know exactly where every tree is, and you know also the biomass, particular plots in the landscape. We've identified every plant as well. Yep. And then that landscape and those plots and those trees become the points which you can then connect to all the other stuff which is being seen from above. Yeah. So it's all about connecting bottom up with top down. Conceptually quite simple, but practically pretty challenging. To do this properly requires a lot of work. We think pushing 170 sites across the world, of which at least 100 would be in the tropics, where you have this kind of process done. Okay, so that's a lot of work. I'm going to just show a little bit more about that. So the cost for this is somewhere between 50 and 100 million euros, and that will provide that system for 5 years, right? So this is about 22 to the end of the decade, late decade. Ideally, you would take it further, and that network, those sites become not just reference system for biomass, but also for change, right? For monitoring change. If you look at the context of the budgets here, I mean, the picture says it all. This is what we're spending on putting stuff into space, nominally with the intention of measuring biomass. This is what's needed, essentially, to make sense of all this and to provide a really good map. I mean, it's kind of just, it's so obvious, it pains me to say it, but we do need to do this. Yeah. Okay, so there's a plan out there, and I think it may eventually happen, because I think it's such a common sense thing. And then kind of related things, how do we measure what's happening on the ground going forward? And this is the pitch for the stuff that rainfall does and connected networks. And I would call this equitable continuity. So this is continuing those sites, that monitoring, but also ensuring that you're building in training and you're building in leadership from within the country more and more and more, so that by not too far ahead, those networks are led from within the tropics, and the whole process becomes, if you like, a bottom-up from tropical nations alone. That's the hope. And we think we can do it. You can do it collectively. And one way it can be done is by connecting networks. So within Forest Plots Net, which is essentially a data management tool more than anything else, 24 different international and other large networks are contributing. These are all their plots, and it's a tremendous amount. Okay, some of these are just single census, and some of them stay single census, but more than 1,000 are multi-census plots, and they're well scattered across the tropical forests. And if you measure 1,800 of these, which is basically how many plots there are already with at least 2 censuses in intact forests, from 24 networks on a 4-year cycle, that's what you need to do. Then you'll be able to measure the sink, where it is, where it's changing, why it's changing, and what all those modifying factors are that we talked about. That will cost roughly $8 million a year. Now, of course, that will provide a whole bunch of things, and it could also help calibrate satellites. So the point is not to say it's not either or one or the other, but for roughly $10 million or less a year, we can do so much more than you can do for hundreds of millions putting sensors into space, and you can make sense of what they're telling us. Okay. So this is the final slide then. Okay. So what we really need to do is really stand back and think it's about changing values. You know, when we're asked to think about what are the priorities? Well, actually, let's look inside ourselves. What do we value as scientists and as politicians and as societies? And question, what are the drivers of everything that we're doing? And I think the real big problem is this, that we're funded to work on 3-year cycles typically. We're funded to invent or imagine a hypothesis or a situation and test it and find out, use that to predict, and then test what we're going to find within 3 years. That's really hard. There's a few folks in the audience I know who are into long-term science. They will understand that often when you do this sort of work, what you find out is it's just much more interesting than you set out to investigate in the first place. And it's probably completely different. And you're actually addressing a different question. And that's the power of long-term work, is actually helps to unlock your mind as well as address what you thought was interesting at the start. I do think we just got to distinguish what is technology, what is science, right? And there's just so much now. We have a UK research and innovation council, I guess they call themselves, and they are tasked with sustaining UK science, but also building the technological base too. And I do think they're actually different things. We need to be really clear-headed. They're not the same thing. Sensors are always temporary, right? I mean, the battery's going to run out, or they're going to fall out of the sky. And those things happen a lot faster than you would imagine. And plots can be permanent, and also skills can be if you keep on teaching them, right? So this is how we kind of get beyond the short-termism, I think, is think about what really lasts. And when we're looking about technology, it's got to be all about integration. How do we integrate the new sensor, the new method with what we know already? Otherwise, we're not going to be able to look back and have a baseline. Okay, there's a brilliant example of this is the Landsat program, which started with a pretty narrow set of sensing technologies in the 70s. And they've been able, more or less, to continue building on that over time, getting to be more and more high resolution, but still able to look back. And therefore, you have a baseline. And finally, it's just get real about who really is doing the work, who's taking the risks, sometimes putting their lives on the line, quite literally, and who's measuring the trees and the species. And that really ultimately comes back down to funding and funding partners fairly and helping them develop as scientists too. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we'll move on to just a couple of minutes of discussion, and then we'll move on to open questions from the audience and also from the online audience. Thank you, Oliver. That was a very compelling personal vision for the tropics, and I think you made a very compelling case there for why it's important to have this model of both long-term investment, but also equitable distributed investment. So in your ideal world, what are mechanisms that could support this? So, it's very hard to imagine NERC being able to support something on this scale, spatially as well as temporally. So what are the mechanisms that could be used to support this long-term vision?
Yeah, well, this is literally the $1 million question or the $50 million question. I think, yeah, it's probably not NERC, but NERC obviously helps tremendously. In fact, without NERC, I should say also that none of that would have been possible too. So anyway, just to be clear, UK funding has provided a huge boost to this work. Foundations, individuals able to take the long-term view and with enough money to say, well, here's whatever it takes. Come back to me in 10 years' time. No, you report every year. I think also one of the key challenges is how do you bridge that technological community with the observational community, right? So there are a lot of people invested in looking down with very, very high-tech kit. And I think when you talk to those folks individually, as I've done, most, I think, will acknowledge that they do need to calibrate, validate what they're doing always, right? That's really important. And how are they going to get to that point where they acknowledge that, if you like, publicly to their funders, to their governments? That's a challenge. I don't know if they will, but I really hope so. And if the folks who are kind of connected to space agencies here, we need you to help, actually. We really do. And the folks on the ground, a lot of people want to contribute data to validating these instruments. But a lot of people feel afraid that once they've done that, they've lost their bit of science and their bit of work, which is their own personal investment. So the challenge is really making those people feel valued and building some kind of sustainability into their processes. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but it requires vision from funders to go beyond, this is the short-term perspective, and this is the best answer now, to thinking, this is our long-term view of how we want science to be and how we want the world to operate.
In some ways, if you think of how much progress we've made in observational climate science, it's the global network of weather stations funded to things like the WMO, and to some extent we need ecological weather stations that look at these things.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll open up to wider questions now. I'll start off from one online. This is related to this question, which is from Arildo, which is, he wanted to know a little bit more about what this $8 million number included. Was that just fieldwork costs, or does that also include investment in the infrastructure for the tropical institutions that support this network?
That's a very good question. So when you're asked how much does it cost to measure a plot, it really is how long is a piece of string. Okay, just to measure the plot, it may be $2,000 or $3,000. This budget includes that. It includes a training component, and it includes materials and consumables, and it includes some overheads for the tropical institution. Okay, but it still doesn't include training at postdoc level, the kind of network interchange costs that those institutions also need in order to connect themselves to the outside. So it's come a long way along that piece of string, but you could go higher still. And if you were going to invest in what you might call full cost science, so those of us in UK universities know all about full costs, and they're 100% overhead rates, if you were to apply that model, the number would be a lot more than $8 million. I don't know off the top of my head, but it'd probably be twice that. Yeah, so if we were going to fund those institutions to the level we fund Oxford University or Leeds University when we get a grant, it's probably going to be $16 or $20 million. Still not that much.
Thank you. Okay, well, we can open up to the floor now. So, Kathy, there's a microphone coming your way.
So, Oliver, thank you. That was a fantastic talk. If I could just come back to the science for one moment, and I totally agree with everything else you're saying. How much do we know about the soils and what's going on in the below ground processes in these plots? And how much do you think that may also be influencing some of those, the growth or the mortality things that we're seeing, that balance in there? And I suppose, is that a missing gap? You talked about botanists, but what are the mycologists and the soil scientists? And where are they in this sort of data gathering exercise? Or it's more than an exercise. That sounds very small, sorry. You know exactly what I mean. This massive exercise.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, what's happening below ground? I should say, first of all, actually, to answer, so if anyone's listening, watching or listening, and is interested in these plots, please get into contact via forestplots.net with the administrators, and if you want to contact the plot owners directly, please do so. Most people will welcome you if you've got a new measurement protocol you want to try out in your place, especially if you've got the budget, you're going to come and do it. Yeah. So that's, in a way, it's like, as we were talking earlier, there's no lack of questions, there's no lack of things to do. But direct answer is not a huge amount. We've done nutrient measurements in quite a lot of rainfall plots pretty well. And we've got soil texture worked out to depth. So if you combine that with water table measurements, which need to be done in many places, then you get an idea of how water can be transferred through the column. And that can help you to sustain individual-based modeling of how trees are going to perform ecophysiologically. Yeah. But the short answer is a lot more to be done. Will they modify the global change responses? Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, the thing that I think is kind of obvious is that where you have lots of nutrients, then you're going to have the CO2 fertilization continue for much longer. But to be honest, we don't know. We have to look. And it's, it hasn't, when we looked 15 years ago, it wasn't that clear, but it may well be now. But as you know, even nutrients are hard to measure. So phosphorus, there's 7 different kinds of ways of measuring phosphorus. So if there's a soil scientist in the audience, they can remind us, but I think it's 7. And it's not clear for many plants which of those different measurements is the best. So which best reflects their ability to use phosphorus and to access it. It could be that the total phosphorus is important, because if they've got the mycorrhizae you're talking about, they may be able to access all sorts of occluded forms of phosphorus. But the agriculturalists will tell you, no, that stuff is just out of bounds, and it's just the braze or something else that we can use. So, yeah, a lot of detail when you get into it, but you need soil scientists too. Yeah.
I know you've thought about this question, but I'd like to hear how you think about this. So you talked about the importance of local collaborators and including large networks of collaborators. How do you envision that interfacing with the emphasis on open data and big data and like big data synthesis efforts, which sort of gets your second, it's like bullet points 2 and 3, right? Like the integration data points. So like, what is the interface of integration, especially at scale, with collaborative networks that are inclusive and that value the work that people put in on the ground? And how do you think about that problem, and what's the way forward there?
But if you have an answer, I'd be really willing to discuss it. Because yeah, it's a great question. Right? It's a really challenging question that gets the nub of what we're doing. Because I think as scientists, we agree that being open is really good. It's good for our science. It's fun, and it helps other people, and it helps replicability and verifiability and all the other things we know are important. So we want to be open with our data and with our science. On the other hand, I think we need to recognize that for many people, there's an element of loss of control, which is not just psychological, but it's actually real. So if you invest a lot of your time in creating a data set, once you make it open, other people are going to publish from it and you're not. And you may struggle to get funding to, as we've seen, just to go back to the plots and remeasure, right? So you may have lost your scientific resource. The way we're trying to do it in forest plots, I'm not saying this is the way, because I think there are lots of ways, is you say to people, you are the data owner, it's your choice. If you want to make things completely public, you can. But to be honest, very few people do, given that choice that we're working with. They prefer a model where they get asked each and every time that someone wants to use their data, and it's like a one-off use every time. And I think that's the best. I must admit, it scares me the extent to which it's very, very easy to hoover up data from many, many places, and there's smart people doing that around the world. And it worries me when there is not the investment going back into the ground communities. So I think it's, the deeper answer to the question is that it's everyone's responsibility, and we need to be aware of this. And if we're arguing for open data, we also need to check ourselves and make sure that we are also investing in the processes that create the data in the first place, which ultimately means the people. So it's a complex question.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple of them online. I'll combine them into one question, because I think they're a bit about putting tropical forests in the context of the global carbon cycle. And Peter Williams asks, how do boreal forests compare with tropical forests in terms of carbon sink? And Angela Abraham asks, oceans are the major carbon sink on Earth. Why are you concentrating on tropical forests?
Okay, quick answer. Boreal forest, I'm no boreal forest expert. I'm sure we have at least one in the audience from Sweden here. Boreal forests, as I understand it, are more driven by disturbance dynamics. So you can have stand replacing disturbances, which in large parts of the wetter tropics very, very rarely happen, right? So a lot of the boreal systems are in successional dynamics, even if they're, quotes, intact in terms of human impacts. Doesn't totally answer the question. It means it's a harder question to address, because every single forest is going to be a trajectory of recovery and occasionally catastrophic loss. If we look back so where I have most confidence would be sort of 1990 to 2010, the tropical forest intact sink was the most powerful forest sink on the biosphere. It's a moot point whether it still is. Yeah, boreal question. The oceans. Oh, I don't know. I mean, the oceans are fascinating, but we can't do it all. The ocean sink is, as I understand it, and maybe you correct me, is essentially a chemical process as much as a biological process. So it's CO2 being dissolved in water, and as the CO2 partial pressure rises in the atmosphere, a bit more of it's forced into water, right? So it was a physical process, actually. There is some biology as well, probably. I'm not a physicist, so.
If I can add another on the ocean one, which I think there is a biotic pump in there as well, but most models agree on the size of the ocean sink, and they agree with the observations. And as you go into the future, there is some divergence there, but the land surface is so much more heterogeneous, more patchy. Ecological processes are so much more poorly understood. So the bigger uncertainties are in the land sink than in the ocean sink. As part of that. Okay, there are some hands up there. Back there.
Very interesting talk. You're operating, or you're working in a very politicized environment, and I'm thinking not just of the global warming debate, but also of all of the countries that you've shown up there are ex-colonies, so they have a history of colonization. I wonder if you could just give us a flavor of the political dimension of your work. Thanks very much.
That's a really another great question. Quite hard because I've been working in many different countries, so it's, if I pick up one rather than the other, I'll try not to do that. I think I'm not sure about. I think one recognizes the privilege that you arrive into a country with. You have more resources apart from anything else than the colleagues you work with, and I think you have to really, you have to recognize that. And make sure that you're always contributing. I mean, that to me is the challenge always that we have. I think that's the big one. Beyond that, I would say, often as an outsider, it's actually easier than it is for people in country. And that's something I've learned, and I've also reflected on as another privilege, because you come in and you are not within the existing professional relationships that exist within the country, which often can be very strained because we're all competing for resources. And when the pool is smaller, of course, the competition can be really bad. By coming from outside is actually, you're in a privileged position which actually allows you to connect groups more easily than perhaps one can do within country. So yeah, it's challenging. But the politics cuts, as you know, I'm sure it's at all levels. It's the personal level right through to the national. And of course, there's community politics, there's regional politics. You may very well have permission from the national park authorities to visit an area. But you may go and find out that actually there's a community there. And you have to, of course, have their assent, consent, and participation too. And sometimes it's very challenging. The nice thing about working in plots, I would say, is that it allows you to go back to the same places and often the same people, and therefore you are, to some extent, able to sustain relationships and build on them. Yeah, and also, in some cases, see how you can perhaps help, and maybe there are students you can help bring on. So I recommend it for that reason alone, really.
Okay. So at the back there.
Thank you. It was an amazing talk. Actually, I'm from Peru, so I'm really glad to see how you give credit to people in the field. I think that's really very important, and it's not always done in academia, so thank you for that. But my question is, if the local institutions like the governments or local NGOs are actually using this information to shape local policies or to start new research. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in the Peruvian context, so the National Park Authority is in the process of trying to make the Peruvian network, a part of it, a national network. So, because what we want to do is transition from being just a science-led network, and particularly scientists from outside, to being something that's led from within country. And within Peru, there's enough energy and good people involved. I think that's going to happen. So it'll be a Peruvian network. And also at the same time, the fact that Peru has been able to demonstrate it has a carbon sink in intact forests is something that is at least mentioned in the COP process when the Peruvians participate. So there's kind of that follow through to some degree. But I'd love to see much more. One really would. I think all countries recognize now they need to be tracking what's happening to their forests. And of course, the easy way is from space, because that's how you get deforestation, to some extent degradation. But to go that extra step, to know what's happening inside in terms of carbon dynamics, but also biodiversity, which we haven't talked about. Are the species here, is the biodiversity stable or is it changing? You need monitoring. And so all countries need to be doing this, and I think they're recognizing it more and more. The international process is helping because the level of obligations of reporting they have to do is rising all the time. So I'm optimistic for the future, but not as much as we would like yet.
It's Charles.
Thanks, Oliver. That was a really great talk. You mentioned just at the end there reporting and the increasing obligations that are being put on the private sector to report what they're doing, going all the way back to carbon footprint and deforestation. Is there any way that some of the large amounts of funding that is going to go in that direction could conceivably be redirected towards forest plots and similar initiatives?
Yeah. Oh, it would be fantastic. It would be fantastic. I mean, we are. I mean, some initial conversations have been had along those lines. I mean, yeah, so I won't mention names, but this, there are companies out there who want to use AI and forest plot data and satellite data to produce carbon maps, and then this is for MRV, for carbon reporting, right? But partly because they're not actually currently making money, they don't have money to invest. They have some venture capital, but they weren't prepared to step forward and put some of it into forest plots, because it's not a commercial operation, it's a scientific operation. But yeah, you have to, I think to make the carbon markets work really well for tropical forests, right, this needs to happen. And certainly if we don't have biomass maps that agree, let alone that we have confidence in, it's always going to be a challenge. And I'm hopeful that, again, smart philanthropists will see that if you want to have a carbon market working for people in the tropics, and perhaps for companies elsewhere, you need to bridge these communities. So someone needs to fund it. Otherwise, these companies actually aren't going to make very much money, because no one's going to believe the products that they're trying to sell.
You still have a question? Go ahead.
Hi, Oliver. Thank you. Fantastic talk. I basically have two kind of main questions in here. You have made a case about how useful these forest plots are across the tropics, and it makes total sense. But at the same time, in a way, it gave kind of a neutral to negative connotation to this remote sensing component of it. So I would like to know if you have kind of positive views about the use of remote sensing actually for tracking basically tropical forest kind of behavior through time. And also, what is your take about why are we so focused only on carbon capture, while this is only one of the, let's say, services or that this nature has for us, right? Yeah. Besides so many others that we can actually track and measure from the plots itself and with remote sensing as well.
Yeah. So has, I mean, very good questions. Okay, the remote sensing side, I make the case strongly because to be honest, I'm a bit fed up of also being in perhaps remote sensing groups, and we're reading the stuff about how wonderful things are without acknowledging the issues. So in a way, there's a kind of, it's as a counterpoint partly, but clearly what we need to be doing is integration, right? And I think also remote sensing, most people in the community will recognize there is no magic sensor, right? So the challenge is going to be increasingly, how do you bring things together? But each group seems to have an agenda. We need to, LiDAR's the best, radar's the best, hyperspectral's the best, and this is what we need to invest in. Actually, there needs to be a kind of a larger scale perspective which says, if you're going to have continuity and you're going to leverage the maximum value from all these different ways of looking at forests, you have to bring them together, and you have to make sure they're overlapping in time as well. And you have to connect to the ground. So that I guess what I'm saying is that the challenges of getting really good science out of this stuff tend to be swept under the carpet to some extent. So this is, I kind of see it as important to make that point. But, yeah.
I'll take a final question online, which is quite an appropriate one because it's from a Peruvian scientist called William Farfan Rios, who epitomizes this and has collected lots of data from difficult places in the Andes. And also, we both had a role in mentoring in various forms. So going back to science, he says, given what you found in the changing forests, where do you see, what do you imagine intact tropical forests look like in 50 years' time? And how will they look and function? How will they be different from the past?
Well, yeah, hopefully they're still there. That's the first thing. It's like, let's hope they're not cut down, William. Hopefully they won't be. I must admit, I find myself more optimistic than I think at least the media is or the public is about if we can keep those intact forests standing, how they're going to be. In fact, they'll go as far as to say, if we can keep them standing, they're almost more or less going to look after themselves. Yeah? So though I want to find out the answer, and one does it by measuring, one shouldn't prejudge what's going to happen. I'm relatively optimistic about their ability to withstand climate change. At least, within bounds, of course, within bounds. And part of that is because we've seen a sink, and we've seen essentially that CO2, the good side, inverted commas, has more than mitigated the bad side so far, okay? The pessimism comes from what's going to happen to forests per se. We have to keep them standing, and that to me is the big challenge. What we don't know, say this to William and others, is how biodiversity is going to fare, and there's some evidence that the species of trees are not able to keep track with climate change, so they're unable to migrate as fast as they need to, say, across the Amazon basin or up the mountains, because that's obviously, as a tree, is quite a hard thing to do, right? You kind of just do it by generational change. So I think the threats to intact forests could come more to loss of species in the end than loss of carbon function.
Great. So I think there's so much to know, but that's not always a narrative that comes out actually from your expertise. There's reasons, as long as we can keep the forest there, there's reasons to be optimistic, I think, as to provide all the benefits and richness that they do today. So I think it's a good note to end on. So thank you, Oliver. I'll get a round of applause for terrific work.